Chapter 7. Our Revolutionized Modern Times. The Tribulations of a Decadent Revolution. It is 1940, the last year of the presidential regime of Lázaro Cárdenas. 30 years before, the revolution that would overthrow the petrified Porfirian regime had erupted. In 1917, the new constitution was promulgated, setting the legal framework within which Mexico would develop. This Mexico emerged from the armed conflict from the first great revolution of the 20th century. The factional struggles and the parallel or divergent political interests that surfaced during the period of armed conflict have been reconciled or eliminated by now. At the least, they have been forced to work together within a new, unified scheme of national power after 25 years of ongoing bloody struggle. What, then, is the new structure of cultural control created by the revolution? First of all, the principal groups that held power during the Porfiriato were all displaced. The old landowning oligarchy had felt the impact of the agrarian reform, which had intensified without precedent during the last 6-year term. The regional political bosses who sustained centralized power had still been evident, although perhaps under different names, at the point of triumph of the revolution. By 1940, most of them had been destroyed or incorporated into the new political apparatus, the new official party created by Calles. The army of the poor masses, Los Pelones, had been replaced by the new revolutionary army, which, in turn, had lost its preeminence and was under the control of the civil authorities. The foreign interests, which directly controlled basic sectors of the Mexican economy at the beginning of the century, had been seriously affected, if not eliminated. The last blow was the recent expropriation of the oil companies. The ideological advisors of the old regime, the científicos, had been replaced by a new band of intellectuals who assumed the task of constructing and justifying the revolutionary project. The process of excluding the Porfirian power groups was based, at first, on the rebels' successful use of armed force. During the armed struggle, this force depended on the support and direct participation of the majority of the country's population. Shortly afterward, the revolution-turned government also used the force of law to restrict or suppress the cultural elements and the resources that the defeated groups considered their own. Now they would be put at the surface of the nation, that is, of the new regime. Who replaced the old Porfirians in power? The first group was the generals and leaders of the revolutionary armies. Among them, the struggle for domination continued. At least, the struggle continued to preserve the privileges they considered their own, earned through participation in the armed conflict. These privileges included personal and group benefits, programs and demands, and authority within some particular region. In the new struggles between the victors, many were physically eliminated. Others were relegated to the rear, and some were rewarded in the final unification, the last round between the winners to determine who would emerge victorious. But the generals could not remain alone or last very long as leaders in an institutionalizing country, one that required the presence of other groups and other talents. The new groups gained power within a complex political mechanism to which they had access in corporate fashion. The workers joined through their unions and central offices, which are both faithful to and recognized by the government. The campesinos participated through their unified organizations, controlled from above. The army quickly lost its representation as a separate sector of the political apparatus. The popular sector had room for everyone and ended up being the most important group, with the greatest influence over decision-making. Along with these groups, there was a growing bureaucracy with power of its own. There was also a private enterprise sector for the government provided every advantage: energy production, highways, training of workers, financial incentives, market protection, and so on. These were provided in exchange for not opposing government policy and for participating in national development projects that were seen as imminent and unstoppable. Of course, participation in decision-making and the rewards of cultural control were not distributed equally or unconditionally. To be in the game, one had to accept the rules. One of them, obedience to the highest decisions, which were concentrated overwhelmingly in the person of the President of the Republic, became increasingly rigid through time. Compliance and loyalty were basic premises of participation in the new order. In return, there were corporate and individual rewards, on the basis of every rascal gets his just reward, but also it takes money to make money. With time, the inequalities grow larger instead of diminishing. The biggest fish, if they did not eat the smaller ones, at least drove away all the food supply. The new groups in power had to make decisions over a larger and more varied collection of individuals and cultural resources in the country. That had been, of course, one goal of the revolution: to break the economic, political, and social ties that restricted national development in the Porfiriato, and to establish a different distribution, broader and more democratic, of the goods that constituted the cultural patrimony of the country. Thus, material resources that already existed, land, oil, railroads, and the like, came under state control. So did new productive enterprises that the government founded and that made the public sector grow, along with the social sector controlled somewhat indirectly by the state. A process of this kind requires control not only over material resources, but also over all the cultural elements that make them productive and meaningful within the overall plan. Thus, governmental action encompassed, to a greater or lesser degree, other areas of Mexican life and try to expropriate or create the cultural elements indispensable for formulating and implementing the national plan. A first goal gave a new face to an old liberal longing. Mexico should be a culturally homogeneous society. On what basis could that unity be achieved? Once again, the opinion was mestizaje. It was thought that Mexico was a mestizo country and that the remnants that were not should integrate themselves as quickly as possible. This was taken as an obligation by the revolutionary governments and became converted into an important ideological element to reinforce their legitimacy and underline their originality. There were immediate antecedents. In 1909, Andrés Molina Enriquez had published Los Grandes Problemas Nacionales. One paragraph summarizes the author's vision of the heterogeneous composition of Mexican society. The fundamental and undeniable basis of all work dedicated in the future to the good of the country has to be the continuity of the mestizos as the preponderant ethnic group and as the political class directing the population. For Molina Enriquez, only the mestizos were in a situation to achieve integration. He saw the Indians as divided, disorganized, without internal cohesion, and occupied only with their own subsistence. The Creoles no longer counted as a historical group capable of embodying Mexican nationality. Since the liberal triumph of 1857, that ideological role had been played by the mestizos, who were always seen as the product of the enriching confluence of two races and two cultures. Those who assumed themselves to be mestizos did not want to be Creoles, much less Indians. They attempted to be something new, something whose contents were never satisfactorily defined. Why was it declared that the revolution was a mestizo project? Those who went to La Vola, as the revolution was properly called, came from all strata, groups, and regions, although not in equal proportions. Neither did they have the same possibilities of incorporating their specific demands into the programs of the multiple contingents who rose up in arms all over the country. Within the masses of combatants, the majority were Indians or de-Indianized campesinos. The military and ideological commanders, on the other hand, were people who came from the urban middle classes. These people had been politically marginalized during the Porfirian peace. However, not all groups were dominated by urban middle-class leaders. The agrarian movements, especially the Zapatistas, accepted the participation of urban intellectual sympathizers, but did not lose control of their own forces or give up their own demands until their final defeat. During the armed phase of the revolution, both the imaginary Mexico and the Mexico Profundo participated, each for its own reasons and seeking its own objectives. Later, the revolutionary groups joined together to the elimination of some and the subjugation of others, and an official version of the revolution was created. These events have made it possible to ignore or underestimate the fact that the revolution consisted of a great diversity of uprisings, which responded to a large degree to a very particular local and regional condition. Of course, all of these were the result of forms of domination that crystallized in the last third of the 19th century and the first decade of the 20th. But in no way were they uniform or of equal strength in all regions of the country, or in different strata of the population. A single lit fuse blew up very different powder kegs. Motives for participating in the struggle were varied and in some cases, perhaps, antagonistic. The personal accounts that have been collected in recent years from people who lived through the revolution show clearly that many parallel histories led to the defeat of the Porfirian regime. Those histories have not unified. Some triumph over others in the struggle for power, some obtain rewards, and the rest remain as they were. The formal unity achieved at the end of the 1920s represented the confluence of the victorious currents, but not the integration of all the interests and demands that had converged in the revolutionary movement. The victorious plan that defined the policies of revolutionary Mexico was not the agrarian program of Zapata and other groups, which had risen up for the same reasons and with the same objectives in various parts of the country. They fought with very clear ideas, which John Womack summarizes thus at the beginning of his book on Zapata and the Mexican Revolution. This is a book about country people who did not want to move and therefore got into a revolution. Obviously, these were not the wishes that predominated in the national goals formulated by successive revolutionary governments. Nevertheless, the real participation of the Mexico Profundo in the revolutionary process made it indispensable for incorporating campesino demands, especially demands for the restitution and distribution of the land. But the revolutionary program did not identify itself with the deeper purposes of the Indians and campesinos. To put it differently, they wanted to maintain their own culture, exercise greater control over it, and on that basis develop it. They did not want to substitute something else for it. They did want to enrich it by recovering the levels of cultural control that 4 centuries of domination had taken away from the villages and communities. The agrarian reform had only one meaning for the campesinos: recovering a territory that was an indispensable physical resource, but at the same time a social space full of symbolic and emotional meaning. It meant the possibility of survival, but also of continuity. For the revolutionary planners and leaders of Mexico, the agrarian reform had another meaning. It was indeed a way of carrying out social justice, but above all, it was a way of making the earth produce through the new projects of national development. This plan did not support the continuity of the Mexico Profundo, but rather its incorporation and its negation in what was going to be a new society. For this reason, Mexico had to be mestizo, not plural, and especially not Indian. The ideological conception of the mestizo Mexico of the Revolution was not and has not been an easy one. Schematically, the predominant version may be stated thus: the deep roots of our nationality are in the Indian past, the point at which our history begins. It was a glorious past which was brought to a halt by the conquest. Since then, the real Mexican, the mestizo, has arisen. He triumphs over his history through a series of struggles, independence and the reform, which are linked harmoniously until they lead to the revolution. The revolution is the final event in the struggle of the Mexican people, the mestizos. It is a necessary fact, foreseen and anticipated by history. After the revolution, the full incorporation of the Mexican in universal culture will be possible. This ideology was expressed in many ways in the artistic and cultural production sponsored by revolutionary governments until 1940, and with less emphasis and more sporadically since then. The Indian roots were always recognized. The morals glorify pre-colonial Mexico, and Indian symbols preside over all the allegories about the history and destiny of the country. Nationalistic music tried to revive instruments and rhythms that sound pre-Hispanic. Architecture at certain points even included Aztec and Maya ornamentation. Archaeology was seen as a patriotic and nationalistic task, which should finish restoring the great temples and filling the exhibit cases of the museums, the new temples of nationality. Cuauhtémoc is the original hero, the first Mexican to symbolize the eternal struggle for national sovereignty. Resounding formulations to this effect are not difficult to find. The Manifesto of the Union of Technical Workers, Painters, and Sculptors from 1923 affirms, quote, "The art of the people of Mexico is the greatest and most wholesome spiritual manifestation in the world, and the country's indigenous traditions are the best to be found," end quote. Unlike Creole nationalism, the nationalism of the Revolution could not ignore the living Indian. Indian faces invaded the great panels of the Mexican School of Painters, the engravings resurrecting the powerful heritage of Posada, and illustrations filling the textbooks. There are Indians with bronze faces, slanted eyes, and high cheekbones dressed as campesinos or dancing in their ceremonial costumes during the village fiesta. Sometimes they are shown in an allegory, fraternally embracing a soldier who is also an Indian, or a mestizo worker dressed in blue, or some engineer with blonde hair and blue eyes. Popular art and handicrafts were highly valued and served as symbols for affirming the special nature of mestizo Mexico. The Mexico Profundo showed its real presence for a moment, and it was not possible to close one's eyes to it. And in an optimistic stupor, we became aware of unsuspected truths. Mexico existed as a country with capabilities, with life, with its own problems. It was not just a transitory or permanent geographical location of the body, with the spirit living elsewhere. And the Indians and the mestizos and the Creoles were living beings, humans with all the corresponding attributes. Mexico and the Mexicans existed. Manuel Gomez Morin, quoted in Monsiváis, 1976, page 331. But if the Indian really did exist and the Mexico Profundo was real, if Indians possess positive and preservable values, then revolutionary Mexico proposed to, quote, redeem them, incorporating them into national culture and through it, universal, that is, Western culture. In addition, revolutionary Mexico tried to appropriate all the symbols of the Mexico Profundo that could be used to construct an image of a mestizo country. Jose Vasconcelos' education program is the absolute expression of these ideas. He sponsored mural painting and put Quetzalcoatl next to Christ and Buddha. But he rejected teaching in Indian languages and was opposed to any educational efforts especially designed for the diverse Indian regions, as proposed by Manuel Gamio. He argued that, quote, first they are Mexicans and then Indians, end quote. Daniel Cosio Villegas summarizes the objectives of that historical moment in these terms. The poor and the Indians, traditionally bypassed, should be a principal and visible support of this new society. Thus, it was necessary to exalt their virtues and achievements, their dedication to work, their good judgment, their withdrawal, their sensibility, as revealed in dance, music, handicrafts, and theater. But it was also necessary to push them into the stream of universal culture, giving them great literary works to read, Plato, Dante, Cervantes, and Goethe. The matter, of course, passed the bounds of literature. Pushing the Indians and the poor into, quote, the stream of universal culture, end quote, was the intellectual project that corresponded to the other levels of the revolutionary global plan. It was about integrating all sectors of the Mexico Profundo into a society that had set out on the path of Western modernization. To achieve this, it was necessary to reduce the distance that separated those sectors from the groups leading modern Mexico. Misery and the most obvious social problems, the result of an incessant process of domination and exploitation for 400 years, had to be eliminated. But the objective was not to create the conditions for the civilization of the Mexico Profundo, of Mesoamerican civilization, to flourish. Modern Mexico did not accept the difference. That is, it did not admit that the national plan could include a permanent Indian population with its own culture, different from the rest of Mexican society. In fact, the difference in civilization was not recognized as such, as we will see in the next section. It was seen as the result of inequality, as an inferior level of historical development within which the Indians have been obliged to remain. If inequality could disappear, or at least be attenuated, cultural differences would disappear at the same time. Insofar as the Indian population in all the sectors that compose the Mexico Profundo are concerned, the revolutionary plans set out conditional responses to their problems. The benefits to be provided to these Mexicans would be at the same time the instruments for their integration, that is, for their de-Indianization. Lands that had been usurped for 4 centuries would be returned, but to modernize traditional agriculture and put it at the service of the country's economic development plan. Schools would be built in the countryside and in the Indian communities, not to stimulate and systematize people's knowledge of their own culture, but so that they would learn the elements of the dominant culture. Medical services were extended, but there was no permanent effort to learn about and develop Mesoamerican medicine. The campesinos' dedication to hard work was recognized and appreciated, but the goal was to apply their work in another manner and to other ends, foreign to the work orientation of the Mexico Profundo. Some parts of Indian and campesino culture were appreciated, for example, handicrafts and artistic expression, but they were considered as isolated activities outside their own context. There was no intention of providing support to stimulate the integral cultural development of the communities. The rights of equality were recognized, but not the right to be different. Once more, the civilization of the Mexico Profundo remained excluded from the national enterprise. The redemption of the Indian through his disappearance. Faced with, quote, the indigenous problem, end quote, The revolution turned government institutionalized a political project for the Indian villages and sought a theoretical basis in accordance with the times. This process gave rise to indigenismo, a movement in defense of Indian cultures. The figure recognized as the father of indigenismo is Manuel Gamio, the first professional Mexican anthropologist. In 1916, Gamio published Forjando Patria, a work that spells out the fundamental direction of indigenismo. These ideas have guided indigenista policy until very recently. During those years, Gamio shared the viewpoint of cultural relativism, a North American school that was introduced very early in Mexico. Its major exponent, Franz Boas, took part in the founding of the International School of American Archaeology and Ethnography, created on the occasion of the centennial. According to the theoretical perspective of relativism, cultural manifestations of different peoples cannot be placed in a single and unique hierarchy of values, as unlineal evolution had required. Rather, each one should be understood and evaluated within its own context and compared with others, without using in these comparisons standards of superiority or inferiority. Gamio's relativist convictions did not match many of the opinions then in vogue, the racial inferiority of the Indian, and the strident denial that Indian cultures had any value whatsoever, which implied the absolute superiority of Western culture in all aspects of life. Simultaneously, however, Gamio admitted the greater development of universal, i.e. Western culture, in a positivistic science and its resulting technology, and in regard to the Catholic religion. He accepted the backwardness of Mesoamerican cultures at the point they encountered European ones, but at the same time he affirmed the existence of positive values in Indian cultures, values that should be respected and even incorporated into national culture. Gamio recognized the cultural diversity of Mexico at the same time as he postulated the unavoidable necessity of creating a homogeneous society in order to forge a true nation. However, his proposal included a kind of transition stage. It would allow space for the cultural peculiarities of the diverse groups and facilitate their firm and less conflictive integration into the new nationhood. Thus, he had no hesitation in recommending that ethnic groups be represented as such in legislative bodies, in the same way as unions, professional associations, and other groups with defined interests. The new state was foreseen as corporate. He insisted on recognizing the regional differences among Indian peoples, which implied that federal policy could not be rigidly uniform. He suggested that many Indian customs, even their internal forms of government, were not incompatible with the creation of a true and unique nation. The minimal requirements were loyalty and participation in a single national enterprise. He insisted on the urgency of training professionals who would be capable of studying the ethnic characteristics of the Mexican population. It is axiomatic that anthropology in its broadest, truest sense should provide basic knowledge for carrying out good government. Since through anthropology one understands the people who are the raw material for governing and for whom one governs. But the ultimate end was not in doubt. Indigenismo did not contradict in any way the national plan that the triumphant revolution had been crystallizing, to incorporate the Indian, that is, de-Indianize him, to make him lose his cultural and historical uniqueness. The question was how to do it more effectively. For Gamio, the path was clear. In order to incorporate the Indian, let us not try to Europeanize him all at once. To the contrary, let us Indianize ourselves a little to present him to our civilization diluted in his. In this way, he will not find our civilization exotic, cruel, bitter, and incomprehensible. Of course, one should not carry closeness with the Indian to ridiculous extremes. As can be seen, Gamio recognized his own affiliation to Western culture, our civilization, the non-Indian one. He wrote as the spokesman of the imaginary Mexico. Manuel Gamio's thesis was to continue inspiring Mexican indigenismo during the following decades and to guide the course of indigenista work in other countries of Latin America. The language and the theoretical dressing changed within the years as they were brought up to date and refined, but the conception of indigenismo as a theory and practice designed and put into place by non-Indians to achieve the integration of Indian peoples into the nation continued. The definition of what is good and bad in Indian culture is what is useful and what should be discarded was not, of course, a matter in which the opinion of the Indians themselves counted. It was a matter, like all indigenista policy, in which only the non-Indians, the nationals, those who exercised cultural control in the country and hoped to extend it further, had a voice. Analyzing indigenista efforts from 1916 to the end of the 1970s, one can confirm the constancy of Gamio's strategy. An integral plan of action was postulated, which would simultaneously attack all the aspects of the, quote, indigenous problem, end quote. These included economic development, education, health, political organization, ideology, and so on. This multiple effort was to be based on scientific research, which would reveal deficiencies, problems, and possibilities so that the necessary cultural change could be carried out with the least possible conflict. Thus, for example, it would be necessary to study indigenous languages and even create writing systems and didactic materials for them, but not with the aim of stimulating the further development of those languages. Rather, they were to be used as efficient, transitory instruments to facilitate learning Spanish and becoming literate in it, as their permanent language. In 1922, the rural school system was created. In 1925, the cultural missions were set up. In 1931, Moises Sáenz headed the team that would carry out the pilot plan for indigenous education in Garapan, Michoacán. In 1936, President Cárdenas created the Autonomous Department of Indian Affairs, or the Departamento Autónomo de Asuntos Indígenas. In 1940, the first Congreso Indigenista Interamericano was convened in Pátzcuaro. In 1948, the National Indian Institute, or Instituto Nacional Indigenista, or the INI, was created. These dates reveal the continuity of educational efforts by revolutionary governments in relation to the Indian population. The goal never varied: to give education to those who did not have it. Which education was it to be, and with what content? Why, of course, it was to be education in terms of the national culture, which was in turn a variety of Western culture. At the beginning and for some time, those entrusted with carrying this civilizing message were non-Indians, carriers by birth of Western civilization. The effort was a failure. They did not understand the Indians, and the Indians did not understand them. It was necessary to find another solution, and it was decided to turn to the Indian youth themselves. The best would be picked, removed from their communities, and taken to civilized surroundings, preferably in the cities, longtime centers of the civilization. There they would be submitted to a brainwashing, as a result of which they would recognize the inferiority of their own culture and the superiority of national culture. Finally, they would be returned to their places of origin, now converted into agents of change. The longed-for transformation that would lead to progress would be achieved more easily from within. Fight fire with fire seems to have been the motto. Some young Indians could be used as convenient tools for de-Indianization, in the same way the Indian languages could be used for teaching Spanish. The vicissitudes of this project and the sometimes contradictory results will be analyzed briefly in the next chapter. In the other areas of integral indigenous action, or acción integral indigenista, the plan was essentially one of substitution. It was true that in some cases, impetus was given to the study of the culture and life situation of populations that inhabited the regions served by the indigenous coordinating centers. These correspond to the systems defined by Aguirre Beltrán as refuge regions. However, these investigations were not destined to found programs for the development of medicine, agriculture, or any other aspect of Mesoamerican knowledge. Rather, they were to establish diagnostic information for finding the best ways of introducing into Indian communities the corresponding practices from national, modern Western culture. There was continuity with the sense of Sahagún's monumental work, understand to better destroy. In the case of the friars, the effort was to find the devil who was always hidden away, masked by apparently innocent practices. In the case of indigenous action, or acción indigenista, it was to discover the factors that prevented the integration of the Indian. These factors, which made him an Indian and not the straightforward Mexican desired by the Revolution, which gave him his particular identity and image, could then be removed more easily. This point is very clearly expressed in one of the fundamental theses developed by Gonzalo Aguirre Beltrán. The Indian should pass from the situation of caste in which he lives into a situation of class, so that from this new position he might contribute to the overall transformation of national society. This is not the place to give a detailed account of the theoretical and political basis on which indigenous action was supposed to be based. The topic was widely debated from the end of the 1960s onward, and there is a vast literature about it. The important point here is to single out the significance of indigenista policy in terms of the system of cultural control that the revolution tried to establish. Indigenismo's outstanding exponents included Aguirre Beltrán, Julio de la Fuente, Alejandro Marroquín, Ricardo Posas, and Alfonso Caso. In setting forth their ideas, in spite of differences of tone and emphasis on certain questions, the conviction is always evident that the integration of the Indian is a desirable goal. It is the only path for achieving national unity and assuring development. Integration is seen as a natural and inevitable process, which in the case of Mexico had been obstructed by historical factors of two kinds. On one hand, there was the denomination exercised regionally by the Ladino groups or non-Indians from the enclave cities in the refuge areas. It was to their benefit to keep the Indian marginalized. On the other hand, there was the resistance to change generated by the Indian cultures themselves. The Indian lived in a narrow, parochial, communal universe, which was impermeable to any sort of modernization. His language, beliefs, habits, and practices tended to isolate him from the new winds blowing in the world. This closed world had to be opened wide and the Indian tossed into the complex turbulence of modern society. I would trade 100 indigenista speeches for a road, Alfonso Caso once said, while he was the director of the INI. To achieve this goal, it was necessary for the Indians to abandon his own culture and adopt a new and different one. The new society did not admit special cultural privileges. That is to say, it did not admit exclusive cultural patrimonies over which control was exercised by members of groups who reserved themselves the right to decide who were and who were not members of the group. And this was precisely the situation that had allowed Indian peoples to survive and to defend themselves over almost 5 centuries. They had conserved a complex of cultural elements that were their own, restricted and precarious though they might be. They included natural resources, forms of organization, communication codes, knowledge, and symbols over which they demanded the exclusive right to make decisions. Indigenous action tried to break that exclusivity and impose control from outside, thus deciding which part of the cultural patrimony of Indian peoples was useful and for whom, and which other parts should be eradicated and by whom. In summary, the attempt was to annul what was left the decision-making capacity of Indian peoples after the constant attacks of colonial domination. Indians were to be fully integrated into a system of cultural control in which decisions would be made in places foreign to the Indian communities themselves. Having achieved this, the revolutionary task of indigenismo would be complete. Indigenous action has been slowed down and frequently canceled out by factors other than Indian resistance. The official government organization assigned to carry out the program, the INI, was placed in a difficult position within the federal administrative apparatus. It became a coordinator of such activities as health, public works, and education, which were already carried out by other branches of the government. This was in a country in which coordination between administrative units is always a declared aim, but has only exceptionally been put into practice, and then in a limited way and for a short period. In addition, there were local and regional interests that indigenous action, in its best moments, necessarily threatened as it attempted to change power relations in order to accelerate integration. The interests of the intermediaries, political bosses, priests, moneylenders, employers of Indian labor, and others were always a difficult obstacle to overcome. One reason was because these groups maintained close and not always mentionable relationships with state and federal authorities. After the first missionary impulse had passed, INI personnel to a large extent lost their enthusiasm and conviction, and a bureaucratic attitude gained ground. In the mid-1970s, a new indigenista discourse was heard in official circles. Proposals that favored a policy of respect towards and stimulus of ethnic pluralism as alternatives to forced integration were popular in the national and international sphere. They were adopted in governmental discourse, but not without contradictions and ambiguities. Indigenous action, meanwhile, extended its scope thanks to a federal program called Coplamar, which gave broader decision-making power to the INI. In practice, the path followed was not that of the new discourse, but rather the well-worn path of integration. Pluralism as an admitted possibility, or participatory indigenismo, etno-desarrollo, and even the necessity of converting Mexico into a true federation of nationalists announced by Miguel de la Madrid during his presidential campaign, already formed in parts of official indigenista language. However, the reality of indigenous action did not take note. The new phase of the imaginary Mexico. After 1940, the Mexican Revolution as a national project was finally defined, marking the path followed by the visible part of the country until the present. The mutual accommodation of the revolutionary forces had reached its end. A new model of development was imposed in which the Mexico Profundo, agrarian and popular, was not the beneficiary, but rather a source from which resources were taken. These resources made possible the growth of the other Mexico, whose outline was industrial, modern, urban, and cosmopolitan. It is worth reviewing quickly the processes that delineate the new face of the imaginary Mexico. An important factor was the industrial takeoff that occurred as a benefit of World War II, and that was initially based upon import substitution. Thus began a process that brought together tendencies whose final efforts were still being suffered by Mexicans in 1987. One result was technological dependence and a constant loss, through royalty payments on foreign technology, of the earnings produced by industry. Another was a growing debt from importation of equipment and parts not produced by national industry. Progressive technological stagnation occurred, and Mexican products came to have scant competitive ability in the international market. The result of policies that protected the internal market by assuring generous profit margins with little effort and low-quality products. Industry was concentrated in a handful of cities, which grew rapidly and chaotically. Iron-fisted control was exercised over the demands of labor, though through unions that responded, in the final analysis, to government decisions. To summarize the whole process in a few words, it represented the expansion of a savage, predatory capitalist system which had no long-term vision. It was supported in 1,000 ways by the public sector within the framework of the so-called mixed economy. In the sphere of agrarian activities, official policy and the predominant tendencies were consistent with the preference for accelerated industrial development. Traditional agriculture was relegated to the background, and an effort was made to discourage diversified cultivation oriented primarily toward consumption. On the other hand, credit, infrastructure, fiscal advantages, certificates of ineffectibility to the agrarian reform, and police force when it was needed all stimulated a system of monoculture for export or for industrial consumption. Cattle raising, mostly for export, was also stimulated. Agrarian reform was halted. Guaranteed prices were established for basic foodstuffs, but in such a way that what those prices guaranteed was that urban populations could buy the agricultural products they consumed at low prices. This meant that salaries could be kept down to the advantage of industrial enterprises. The technological modernization of the countryside was attempted in various ways, including mechanization and the introduction of seeds, fertilizers, and insecticides that the campesinos did not produce. This practice therefore increased their dependence on the dominant society and its scarcely concealed international interests. The experiments at collective agriculture attempted by Lázaro Cárdenas were abandoned. Rural Mexico remained, contrary to its own trajectory, subjugated to industrial Mexico. The cities grew. According to the criteria of official statistics, the country rapidly became urban. The cities expanded without foresight or plan, like mushrooms after a rain. Along with them grew the lost cities, the belts of misery, transportation difficulties, lack of public services, pollution, unemployment either disguised or plainly apparent, conflicts, and crime. In smaller proportions, the beautiful Mexico also grew. It included the beautiful people, each generation taller and blonder, and the exclusive suburbs that ranged from the colonial Syrio-Lebanese style to the new fortresses of the Pedregal of San Angel. Night spots proliferated, as did expensive restaurants and a commerce in insolent luxury. A snobism began with the, quote, Third Mexican Empire, end quote. It was maintained for years by a precious group of the filthy rich, nostalgic for nobility and anxious to rub elbows each week, with a few of the sad figures among the handful of European aristocratic refugees in Mexico during World War II. Snobism extended to the insulting ostentation of the, quote, mighty Mexicans, end quote, of the satiny pages of Town and Country magazine. Thus, inequality grew, not only between city and country, but also in the daily life of the city streets. Many, very many of the Mexicans who are urban, according to the census and their place of residence, do not form part of the imaginary Mexico. They are people who participate but who do not belong. They participate in the miseries and difficulties of the city. They work there when they can and in whatever way they can, and they inhabit a narrow space which they endeavor to make their own and to make different. They are there more through expulsion from the impoverished and abandoned countryside than from attraction to the imaginary shimmer of the city. They do not break their ties with the rural world from which they came. In fact, they reproduce as far as they can in their new environment by raising pigs and chickens, preparing regional dishes, celebrating their fiestas, and forming a social circle with people who share the same nostalgia and the same problems. Urbanization depends on them, but they do not belong to the urban world. Others do belong, or at least want to belong and appear to do so. They are the middle class of whom I spoke in the first part, blinded, torn from their roots, and often farther and farther from reaching their goals and achieving their dreams. The revolution gave a great impetus to this social class. Its growth is another of the processes that give shape to the new face of the imaginary Mexico. It is palpable proof that the revolution is achieving its objectives. It has a level of schooling higher than that of most Mexicans. It enjoys social benefits. It lives in apartments or single-family dwellings. It consumes as much as its budget allows, and it has ambitions and the conformity congruent with the reigning model and system. It has no higher goal than social climbing, or at least maintaining the position it holds. With the cooling of official nationalism, the middle class also abandoned its symbolic ties that united it with the Mexico Profundo. It saw its chauvinism as tacky and gauche and began substituting for it the aspiration of being, or at least seeming to be, gringo. Its patterns of consumptions and behavior, whether real or desired, were oriented in that direction. In 1968, profound disagreements that exploded in the student movement appeared within this middle class. The underlying cause should be sought in the fact that the growth of the middle class had not been accompanied by new or broader avenues of participation in the political decisions affecting its life and self-interests. The political apparatus already gave signs of a dangerous hardening of the arteries. The economic expansion of the imaginary Mexico, the only framework for middle-class expectations, already showed portentous fissures and contraction. Almost 20 years later, we can understand the 1968 movement as a clarion call, a warning signal of danger. The Echeverria period opening and the quick and ephemeral oil boom muffled it to the point of inaudibility. At any rate, something fundamental broke down in 1968. A vast sector affiliated with the imaginary Mexico's confidence in its own future ended. There is another phenomenon whose importance cannot be minimized. The growth of the mass media of information. I write it thus, in formation, to distinguish it from the root word formation, to become informed or educated. Much has been said about the media, but not enough. One must distinguish carefully the press, the radio, and television, to mention only the major media, are all different and have different effects. To go further, one cannot even generalize about the press. How can we judge in the same way the newspapers and magazines devoted to political opinion, to sports, and to fashion? For many, the radio continues to be the medium with the widest coverage. However, television, because it is primarily an urban medium and because of the kind of audience it reaches, is more disturbing and attracts more critical analysis. I will not enter deeply into these questions, since my purpose here is simply to give a broad outline of the system of cultural control in Mexico. For this purpose, some general considerations are sufficient. The media of mass information, bringing their message in different ways to different sectors of Mexico society. The media are more important to those who participate in the imaginary Mexico, since they are basically designed for that part of our world. They are essentially one-directional, centralized, and urban. Their concerns do not include the Mexico Profundo. The latter, rather, appears as something outside, unfamiliar, and picturesque, but above all, dangerous, threatening, and profoundly disturbing. Mesoamerican civilization, for the media, does not exist. It is simply a reference point for tourists. The captive audience to which the media are directed is the one that participates in or believes in the imaginary Mexico, and to them go the news, opinions, images, and sounds. They suggest a way of understanding and living a culture that is not within the reach of everyone. Everyone is not all the people, of course, but to which all should aspire. The media, above all, consolidate a vision of a Mexico that does not exist. They incite those imagining to believe, contrary to all evidence, in the reality of the world presented and the solidity and viability of the project. The messages reach farther, without a doubt overflowing the boundaries of the imaginary Mexico. But what must Otaru Humara think when he sees a video clip? Industrialization, urbanization, middle-classization, information, and other derived or convergent processes of the last several decades would seem to point substantial changes in domination and in the system of cultural control in Mexico. Is this really the case? This question should be seen through the eyes of the oppressed, from their underlying reality. The changes, however important they may seem from the perspective of those who rule, may not seem so to those dominated. The frontiers of expansion have varied and multiplied. They threaten and covet the territory that is the heart of the Mexico Profundo. The communal and ejido lands and the small properties of the peasants continue to be stripped away and to face pressure today, as for the last 400 years, from the unseasoned voracity of large-scale cattle ranching. But there are new interests which also covet those lands. They include urban sprawl, the expansion of the oil industry, the development of tourist sites, and even the establishment of environmental protection zones. Such areas are of discourse understood from the point of view of the imaginary Mexico. Differences unquestionably exist between the frontiers of territorial expansion. Some require local labor to a greater extent than others. Some pay better salaries than others, even though this may be an illusion that lasts only a few months. Cattle raising, city growth, and oil expansion have different ways of destroying vegetation and altering ecological niches, whereas reserves attempt to preserve them. But beyond those differences, all types of expansion threaten and mutilate the people's and communities' lands. They reduce the spaces available and prompt various kinds of defensive responses from the Mexico Profundo. The policy of changing crops does not in principle affect territorial integrity, but substituting monoculture for diversified agriculture has the same destructive effects on Mesoamerican civilization. It attacks the productive system on which the self-sufficient economy is based, subjecting the peasants to dependence, credit, the market, technology, and even management in areas that were formerly under their own control. The same can be said, of course, of programs for modernizing and mechanizing agriculture. The conflicts generated by the struggle for land result, with greater frequency than is noted in the press, in the rule of violence. Neither independence, nor the reform, nor the revolution have allowed the relationship between the imaginary and the Mexico Profundo to escape the dominating presence of violence. This violence is real, bloody, and death-dealing, whether it involves gangs of cattle rustlers, bands of paid killers, or regular army and police. The central conflict is the land, but violence comes into play as well, as a last and sometimes only resort to settle electoral conflicts, problems between communities, religious antagonisms, and power struggles of any sort. The Mexico Profundo is always faced with the final prospect of murder, prison, arson, or torture in accordance with the law or outside the law. The bayonet continues to be accompanied by the cross. There continue to be untrustworthy priests who jealously guard their dominions, which are earthly and hidden from view rather than celestial. The fanatics whose closed minds and humiliate bodies continue to be present. There are obviously others as well, and always were, a minority of priests who identify with the Mexico Profundo and sometimes suffer its same fate. There are clerics who cross the barrier and go over to the other side, not without conflicts inside and outside the church, and inside and outside the communities they want to serve. There are also new characters in the struggle for souls. They include Protestant missionaries, many of whom are foreigners. In indigenous areas, they have provoked bloody divisions within communities. Their individualistic vision blinds them to the reality of communal organization. Their aspirations for life anywhere on earth have as their only undisputed model any small town in the North American Midwest. Individualism, Thrift and moderation, as they understand them, are the supreme values they try to impose. They are foreign values, which necessarily come into conflict with the worldview and social practices of the Mexico Profundo. Also on the scene are the atheistic missionaries, the activists, those who are committed to, quote, conscious raising among the masses, end quote. This is the other side of the same coin. Like the others, they consider themselves the only owners of the absolute truth, those predestined to save and redeem the people. Neither do they understand or think it worthwhile to try and understand the Mexico Profundo. Right now, in the present, it is a mistaken reality to be changed. They do not fight for souls, but for minds, and their doctrine is not religious, but revolutionary. Some die in the struggle, but many more indoctrinated neophytes die. Without offering any judgment about the personal motivations of the different missionaries, one thing is clear. The conscience of the people of the Mexico Profundo, their convictions and beliefs continue to be denied. They are seen as a blank page upon which each outside group has the right and the obligation to write its own particular message. The elementary school has reached almost every corner of the country. That is considered a triumph, another achievement of the revolution. Without a doubt, the right to an organized education is a legitimate and unquestionable right of all Mexicans. But what sort of education, with what content, and for what? One cannot defend the school for its own sake without taking into account the degree to which it responds to the aspirations and the real needs of the population that attends it. The effort has been to create a uniform school system, even though there have been some attempts at special education for certain groups and sectors of the population. A homogeneous education has been the goal, following the constant ideological premise that uniformity is required to strengthen the nation. The result could not have been otherwise. School instruction ignores the culture of the majority of Mexicans and tries to replace it rather than developing it. It is an education planned and decided upon from the center, from the seat of power in the city. It is an education in terms of the imaginary Mexico, at the service of its interests and in agreement with its convictions. It is an education that denies what exists and creates in the student a schizophrenic dissociation between his real life and the hours he spends in the classroom. This tendency is explicit, since the conviction that the school is the path of redemption is built upon a more profound conviction. What you know is useless, what you think is senseless. Only we who participate in the imaginary Mexico understand what you need to learn to make you into someone else. The distance between education and the Mexico Profundo increases as one advances to higher educational levels. The models or paradigms of university education, as well as its content, come from the outside, from more advanced centers of Western civilization. The possibility of any organic link with wisdom of Mesoamerican civilization is rejected. This wisdom is denied, even though it is not understood. The architects are unfamiliar with traditional systems of construction and the meaning of function of space, insofar as they do not correspond with the aspirations of the middle and upper urban sectors. The physicians ignore and scorn the popular use of medicinal plants. The lawyers do not have the faintest idea of customary law, which regulates the daily lives of the majority of Mexicans. The agronomists do not take into account the knowledge of peasants who continue a 7,000-year-old agricultural tradition, since they first invented agriculture itself right here. The economists, because they do not understand it, forget what happens in the informal sector through which millions of Mexicans carry out the majority of the economic activities that allow them to survive. And the list of examples could be extended indefinitely. To put it crudely, the immense majority of Mexican professionals are not familiar with the country in which they live. Here as well, the plans are not for development, but for replacement. The political order created by the revolution excludes the direct participation of the majority of Mexicans. Not even half the citizens have ever voted in a federal election. On occasion, the proportion of elective suffrage has been ridiculous to the point of alarm. In municipal elections, the norm is to not take into account the opinion of the local citizens in the selection of candidates. Rather, they are named from above as a result of power struggles and pressure groups that have nothing to do with local realities and needs. And if this results in disagreement and strong reaction, the recourse is force. I am not stating anything new in this regard. We all know this. The most serious problem is the rationalization given for this situation and the solutions that are suggested. In the imaginary Mexico, the democratic formalities developed in the West as a result of the French Revolution and the U.S. Constitution have replaced the true and profound meaning of democracy. The attempt is to impose a foreign model as the only legitimate form of participation in the political life of the country. This is a leveling mechanism which ignores the methods and criteria through which one accedes to power and through which authority is legitimated in the real-life local groups throughout the country. The exercise of electoral rights, as established in the imaginary democratic system of Mexico, implies participation in a specific political culture that is foreign to the real political culture of the majority. The conceptions of authority and representativeness, the criteria and mechanisms for designating who should occupy posts in the structure of power, the networks of social organization that enter into play in these processes, the language codes and the intellectual and emotional motivations for participation are all different in the Mexican Constitution and in the reality of the Mexico Profundo. The marginalization of political life, then, not only results from the manipulation and confrontation of interests within the dominant groups, but also derives from the explicit decisions of these groups not to recognize or admit the mechanisms of authority established historically in the Mexico Profundo. There is no room for them. As with all other aspects of Mesoamerican civilization, no project exists to create the conditions for liberating the existing authority systems from the structures of external power that oppress and distort them. There is no project to develop these systems. If there were, they might be compatible with the national requirements of a country whose plural nature is accepted as a basis for democratic political organization. From the point of view of the promoters of the imaginary Mexico, large sectors of the country's population turn out to be too immature to accept the democratic system imposed upon them. They may even be openly hostile, enemies of democracy. They do not vote, they are not active in political parties, they do not send letters to their representatives, and so on. The real people are transformed through this ideological alchemy into the obstacle to achieving democracy. In summary, the national project resulting from the Mexican Revolution also denies Mesoamerican civilization. It is a replacement project that does not propose the development of the existing culture of the majority, but its disappearance as the only path for generalizing the culture of the imaginary Mexico. It is a project that ideologically affirms mestizaje, but in reality allies itself completely with only one of the components, the Western one. That which is Indian remains as a past, expropriated from the Indians. That is assumed to be the common patrimony of all Mexicans. However, what was expropriated has no profound content and is converted into a vague ideological pride in what was done by our ancestors. What is left of the Indian cultures of today, after the passing of the nationalist fervor of the first decades, is only a folkloric vision and a multiple feeling of uneasiness about what backwardness and poverty might mean. Above all is the unadmitted perception out there. The imaginary Mexico is detained daily by the Mexico Profundo. This concludes Chapter 7.